Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today, we're going to explore a powerful shift of paradigm in our modern world, which is the emergence and perhaps establishment of polyamory as a way of living in the world in relationship. And as we've been moving around the topic, I am reminded of Jung's corollary, which is salve et coagula. Things dissolve and things come together again. And I think that what we're seeing, particularly in American culture, is this dissolving of the old paradigm of pair bonding and marriage. And in that dissolution, new and in many ways ancient images and variations on pair bonding are beginning to come together and are being experimented with in the culture. The three of us meet polyamorous individuals in our practice. Many of us have been educated by them in terms of what's happening collectively, how this is affecting their souls, and in many ways, they're helping us explore our therapeutic stance around this social phenomena. We have more questions than answers, but it certainly seems like it's something worthy to really be thinking about.
We also have a lot of opinions, I think, some of which I think we will share today. But Joseph, after that really soulful, full of depth introduction, I just need to take it someplace totally different and share with listeners that the three of us have a text thread where we'll, plan when we're going to talk and what we're going to speak about on the next podcast. And at some point this last week, I wrote Deb and Joseph a text. I said, I want to talk about polyamory next week. And Joseph said, great. And Deb said, oh, okay, you can drag me along to a threesome. Which I just thought was great. And of course, we are a threesome. So there you go.
But I actually really enjoy that there's something in the human spirit that, whenever sex is put on the table, there's levity, there's a little bit of naughtiness, there's fun. And I think that spirit of laughter should be part of the exploration of sexuality.
Absolutely. We need to be able to be playful, right?
Absolutely. And in that playful context, we don't have to become overly defended about the very different perspectives that rise up around this manifestation of behavior.
Well, I have to say, in the spirit of playful skepticism, I'm not so sure psychologically, what polyamory really is about in the psyche and where the unconscious is. And my somewhat limited experience through clients and other tangential brushes with this as a concept, my first take on it is that it sounds better as a concept than I suspect it really is in lived life.
Yeah, I'm wondering what the images are that come up for you, Deb, that make you feel that way or move you to say that.
One of the images that comes up for me is, or maybe it's just a fact, is that, in the evolution of mankind, and we're talking millennia here, there have been societal, tribal, cultural, religious strictures, rules, guidelines, religious precepts, etc., around how bonding may or may not occur. It's not always the same, but they are there. And it seems to me that it's a little cavalier to go messing with something that is thousands and thousands of years old And it feels a little bit like rationalization or intellectualization, some kind of a defensive veneer about how now we're all adults and there is the methods of birth control and safety around disease. And so we're all free, liberated, educated, communicative adults. Why not? It feels a little glib, to be frank.
I think that the attitude towards this changing of pair bonding, is profound, and we have to wonder how the depths of the psyche, both collectively and individually, are being affected. But you brought up something that we moved quickly through, Deb, and which I was so pleased, is that this is in the category of pair bonding. And pair bonding is a very well-established area of study among various branches of psychology. It's interesting that only 3% of animal species actually pair bond, but there's something about human beings where, because we have a greater self-aware set of options, human beings have for a long time seemed to have chosen pair bonding, even if that right now is up for grabs.
My understanding of the science, which is far from complete, is that some species, the people that study animal behavior know that some number of species of animals are exclusively monogamous. I think there are some species of birds and perhaps some primates as well. But then there are other animals that are somewhat monogamous. There's a technical term for it that I don't have the top of my head, and we're one of those. We're not exclusively monogamous if you look at humans across cultures. So some of this is biology, right? And what is most adaptive for the propagation of the species. And some of it, Deb, I think what you were alluding to is we're conscious and we have a choice. And so some of this is biology. And some of this is culture. I think in terms of the biology, and Joseph, your point about pair bonding is animals that tend to be strongly pair bonded usually have offspring that are very helpless when they're born. And if you look at birds, for example, or some of the examples of monogamous species, if you're mama owl sitting on the eggs and then taking care of the baby owls that are completely helpless when they're born, the dad owl swoops in a couple times a night and drops off a snake or a rat or something. And they hoot to each other. And then when he arrives, they sort of say hello. And then he's off to hunting. They're strongly bonded because if they weren't, the offspring wouldn't survive. So there's that. And then, of course, in our culture, sex has become uncoupled, forgive the pun, from procreation, right? It's not just about that. We also think about it as being for pleasure or emotional satisfaction.
Well, you went beautifully into a number of really vibrant amplifications on it, but I'm going to pull it back for a moment just to the term pair bonding, because pair bonding is not synonymous with monogamy. Because even in the realm of whether it's polyamory or non-monogamy, people are coming together, and whether the pair bonding happens for one night or the pair bonding happens, over a couple of weeks, there is this phenomena that a human being will want to be connected to another human being with a kind of exclusivity regardless. So there is something archetypal about pair bonding. And of course, then we're in the realm of anima animus and whatever the dynamic is that we have towards connecting with other. But in the science of pair bonding, first of all, there's an admission that there are various kinds of pair bondings over the course of a human lifetime. Some can be temporary, some can be over an entire lifetime, sometimes with somebody the same age or different age groups. But I think in the study of pair bonding, that there are two main areas of consideration among humans, and one is social pair bonding, and the other is sexual pair bonding. And the social pair bonding has a lot to do with behavioral and psychological relationships that is, in fact, measurably different in its psychological and felt terms from general friendships or other kinds of acquaintances. And on the other hand, there are sexual pair bondings, which again have behavior and psychological bonding between individuals, and it's based on strong sexual components. And so people in both of those kind of pair bondings, but more so sexual pair bondings, because they tend to prefer sex with each other, then want to set up institutions that allow that to happen more frequently than not. And, which is where we're going to in a moment, is I think generally they want to protect that sexual pair bonding, that they don't necessarily want to compete for access to the person they want to have sex with, and they want to have regular access to that person. And this also has a whole neurotransmitter component to it, like oxytocin and vasopressin and dopamine, that it really is a tremendous tidal wave of both psychological and physical components that drive us into pair bonding. Now, the question of the social institution of marriage, or how pair bonding is conceptualized, that's what seems to be up for grabs, or at least is in this mutable discussion in the culture. But of course, the way we conceptualize something shapes it. I mean, there's one kind of existentialist psychology idea that reality is even contained in language, that once we begin to set language and concept in a culture, it creates a preference and a clear option of behavior. So, jumping off that soapbox, Lisa's rolling her eyes. She's like, oh my God, did you really just spend like 4 minutes talking about that? I don't know why. I thought it was important.
I'm not really sure where to go with that.
All right. Anyway, so I'm going to take off that goofy professor's cap, the little square thing with the tassel off my head.
Sex is, as it says in one old film that I like, sex is like biological highlighter. We have sex in order to attach. It is an attachment behavior. And why? I mean, why did the species evolve to have to attach to each other in that way? I think it's largely about procreation, but it means that to some degree, we are wired to be connected to someone else and to have that be exclusive. I'm not saying that's 100%. I know that obviously we're not a monogamous species, right? Any therapist knows that. But that there is a strong biological predilection for this, at least among many of us.
And I would add that what human beings add to all this physiology and so on is that when there is a pair bonding, as you call it, Joseph, and it's often sacralized, there is a ceremony, the community witnesses it, there's some way that it is recognized and honored by the two people involved and the larger community as a call to consciousness, a call to a certain kind of restraint, a call to making something really conscious in a way that overrides whatever our, sort of hormones may decide they want in a given moment with a given person. So we've lifted up this idea of pair bonding into something that is unique.
Well, and you also make a conscious sacrifice.
Exactly. There is a sacrifice of it will be you and no other. And will I be attracted to other people? Probably. Will you? Probably.
Stop talking about us, Deb.
So there is a sacrifice, and it's in the service of a bond that has an opportunity through stress, through sacrifice, through all kinds of things, to grow each other, to become much more conscious.
Well, I'm going to just take the opposite view here for just a minute and kind of play devil's advocate as we circumambulate this. And my understanding of what polyamorous person might say to that is that this isn't just a question of going with whatever hormonal desires appear at the moment, that it's a carefully thought out choice, that it requires a lot of work to work things out between multiple partners, that it's about being able to self-actualize through these intense romantic and sexual connections, so that it's not a casual decision, I think, is what someone who practices polyamory might respond to you.
What I'm sitting with the tension of that, and I actually wanted to come back for a moment to Deb before we go to kind of this, the way it's playing out in the social sphere, is Deb was leaning into something when she was mentioning the sacramental archetype of marriage, because I think we're talking about this clarification of archetypes. And what I would imagine is that the archetype around polyamory or non-monogamy is actually quite different. And so if we come back to the idea of the sacrament of marriage, we're talking about a very ancient archetypal image of two becoming one. And if we think about Jung's Rosarium woodcuts that he had analyzed and been very curious about, we've talked about it before in our alchemy section, but it starts with these two highly discrete figures, you know, the king and the queen, who are garbed and in their own worlds. And then through a series of images, the two merge as one. And then this unified being, the divine hermaphrodite, emerges. So there is this archetype of completion, that the two become one. And in order for this alchemical process to happen, the two must be alone in the crucible. The two can't suddenly have 4 dashes of him and 3 dashes of her, and then the experiment stops and then the experiment starts, but at least in the archetypal world rather than the social. So I think there's in the archetype of marriage, there are certain requirements around the laboratory of the marriage, which includes the kind of exclusivity of two psyches, and by honoring the limit of the marital relationship to the two of them, it actually creates a fire of both frustrations and passions, which then cause a change in the two individuals, which then brings to birth something unprecedented, and if one believes it, perhaps something more integrated.
It's a closed vessel, in other words, if you're using this alchemical image.
And it must be for the particular archetypal outcome to have a chance. And of course, many marital therapists might even say this by staying in the marriage, working at it, holding all the tensions and sacrifices. People at the end of many years say that not only am I transformed by the struggles of my marriage, but I am a better man, having struggled through them. The real issue for me in the culture is to admit that archetype does not land or constellate in many people's psyches, and that the idea of polyamory, which means that either there are any number of very transitional vessels to have the relationship, and or the coming together of the relationship isn't carrying any kind of a transformational demand.
You've said a couple times, that the idea of marriage between two people is dissolving, and this doesn't land for many people. And I want to challenge that. I think the number of people currently involved in a polyamorous relationship, of people who would claim that in a survey, is something like 2%. Yes, I mean, it's pretty small. And what I find is that many young people these days are being pressured to engage in a polyamorous relationship, but they don't really want to. So they meet a partner, they meet a woman or a man that they like, and as the relationship progresses and gets negotiated, one or the other partner says, "Yeah, I really, I'm really into you, but I'm polyamorous," and the other partner might feel like it's not okay to say that's not okay with me, that there's a certain kind of social cachet now to being poly in certain circles. And so I feel like some particular young people feel like they don't have a choice.
And I'm thinking about, the time we did a podcast on hookups, and are we, is the poly type thing a way of kind of elevating, at least in terms of a rationale, just being able to have sex freely without any attachments or particular commitments, or, that we're all talking about it, where communicating. This has integrity. There's a love to it, which means, to me, what I'm hearing is it's very ego-based. And there certainly is an archetypal dimension to what we are now calling polyamory, back in the world of Greek mythology. Heaven knows, Zeus was, he traveled all over the Mediterranean, and I've forgotten how many children he fathered with beautiful young women here, there, and everywhere. But that is a very different archetypal ground of desire, sexuality, maybe a kind of Dionysian, to add another god to this mix, another archetypal image. And is that what is somewhere at the base of polyamory? And that is a very different thing from attachment, commitment, and a commitment not just to you and you only, but to my own development with another person. Coming up against the frustrations and the sacrifices relationally that, as you said, Joseph, with the Rosarium images, promise to grow us, promise to really put us on the road, hopefully, to our own individuation, at least in part.
Okay, but again, just exploring the other side, could adopting a polyamorous lifestyle ever be a way of individuating? Could that be part of a person's individuation process?
I think so. I feel sure about it. I can think of a particular work with a client, and this person had been, in a very conventional marriage for a long time, several kids. The kids were getting ready to launch, and she began to feel that the relationship had become so over-controlling in numerous dimensions, also in terms of the erotic dimension of the relationship. And as she outgrew the need for that much, or perhaps the positive feeling about all that control, and transitioned into being single again, she found that part of throwing off this kind of excessive and, to her, alien invasion of control was to actually explore polyamory, to be able to confront her resistances and anxieties and reactions to being polyamorous and find a way, I think she felt, for her heart to be open, as well as her body, to various kinds of relationships, which she in fact did enjoy for many years, and felt that it was individuating in as much as she was able to cast off this invasion of cultural norms, which she had just accepted unconsciously for much of her life. And so I can understand that it really was a kind of act of revolution for this person.
And required a great deal of consciousness and holding a lot in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I want to share just a contrast for a second. I have had multiple people who were in polyamorous relationships in my practice, and I want to say that I have never seen it go well. And I'm not saying that it can't go well. My N is pretty small, and there's no reason to think that that's exhaustive, of course. I think, again, Joseph, to your point, if it's done, it probably needs to be done with a great deal of consciousness. What I have seen is looks to me like a denial of unconscious motivations, a kind of hubris, a lack of awareness of how becoming physical with someone else is likely to affect our feelings for our partner, or how our partner is going to feel about it. And honestly, I see it often as a defense against intimacy. That is how I have seen it operating in the clients who have brought it into my practice. And again, I'm not saying that that's going to be true every time, but I'm a little skeptical.
What I will add to that, in single clients who've had multiple relationships, is I'm seconding what you're saying, Lisa, is that here that person is in an analytic process, which by its very nature, is designed to foster a confrontation with the unconscious. It's an interior relationship. And it seems to me that these multiple relationships, whether we call them anything, we've got this nice, clever term here out there now, but I just wonder if that's a way to avoid sidetracked, or just it can't be a real confrontation with the unconscious because it's external, it's physical. In what sense is it a palliative that I've got this and now I need something else? And it seems to me that it, by its very nature, sort of is one-sided.
Well, it can be. I think if we boil it down to simply sexual opportunity, then it can seem very one-sided, perhaps. But I have to say that the unconscious doesn't let us off the hook, even if we're running away. So it may not be perhaps as much of a conscious confrontation, but just as Lisa's saying, people might think that they're just relieving tension or relieving some kind of inner conflict by being non-monogamous. And yet, as she noticed, all these things erupt forward, and the unconscious still demands a relationship around the various dimensions that are engaged in, frankly, all of our human behavior, but certainly around sexual behavior.
But I also take Deb's point, though, that it's an externalization, perhaps, of an internal conflict. And it's not a particularly psychological stance to say, I'm feeling restless, or I'm feeling like I have unmet needs or something. And I think I'll just go get those met in some other relationship.
But when people take on polyamory as a conscious declaration of their lifestyle, that it really does, my experience with my clients is there's a lot of thought about it. I actually think that when having sex outside of the marriage in a conventional way, or having sex or an affair outside of the marriage, that by virtue of the fact that it's happening in a secret, unexamined way, primarily to avoid shame, that then it's full of all kinds of hidden impulses that are even too shameful to language. One of the benefits that I think claiming polyamory openly affords is that people are actually relieved of the shameful component of it. Because in the journey of legitimizing the term polyamory, they're also legitimizing the fact that they're in a process that they do not have to hide, versus when people are having secret affairs and they're in a process that has to hide and therefore is never examined or examined in conversation.
And I appreciate that. And I agree with you to an extent, because I think claiming it openly, again, opens up this possibility of having a conscious relationship with it. But what I'm saying, Joseph, is that what I have seen in many cases is people claim this consciously, but really they're kind of kidding themselves. That really, it's not about, I just feel, why can't I love 5 people? What's wrong with that? I have a big heart. It's really about, I am too freaking scared to really get honest with my partner and stay here in the heat and get really intimate with this one person. Or it's a way of getting power over another partner, or all kinds of other things that we're not aware of. So I'm just skeptical about our ability to really take on board what we're doing. I'm not saying it's impossible, but in my experience, it doesn't happen very often.
But that paradigm is only valid if we think that polyamory is the better option to marriage. But if we take that out of the conversation, which I'm not sure if people are saying that culturally, but we say that both of them are systems of pair bonding, and both of them have tremendous amounts of shadow. Both of them have tremendous amount of suffering and challenges. But what I would say to your observations, which, by the way, I've also seen, is that any systematized relationship, whether it's marriage, monogamy, or polyamory, is going to bring up problems. So if somebody has a fantasy and says, well, if I was just polyamorous, I would never have relational problems, Of course, that's naive. Or somebody gets married and they say, everything's going to be perfect now that I've married. That's naive. So my question to you, Lisa, is do you actually feel that the kinds of conflicts or the intensity of the conflict that a polyamorous person has are in any way worse than the conflicts that somebody who's traditionally married are?
No, I mean, of course, if you're in a traditional, monogamous marriage, let's say, and you have a fear of intimacy with your partner, there are all kinds of ways to escape that. And claiming polyamory would just be another way. But in the culture right now, there's a certain fascination with polyamory. In some subsets of the culture, it's considered cool and edgy. And so it kind of gets a pass. If you're ducking away from intimacy with your partner by staying at work all the time, well, we know what that is and we can name it. If you're avoiding intimacy with your partner because you're drinking, well, we know what that is and we can name it. But if you say, well, I'm just polyamorous, and really what that's about is not a deep, soulful, conscious exploration of the different ways that one might love, but is really about avoiding intimacy, you kind of get a pass because you're cool and edgy.
So you're talking about how powerful it is when something is socially sanctioned and how it can often make it seem like it's an option that is more available because at least we don't have to overcome a social disapproval.
Yes. And I want to say, I'm going to climb on my soapbox for a second. I have seen in some of the professional organizations for therapists a pressure for therapists to become poly-aware or something. I don't know what the terminology is, but there's been an effort to really normalize this. And I'm not in favor of excommunicating anyone, but I do want to be thoughtful before we just say we're going to normalize this, because maybe it works to try to encourage people to stick to the thing that we know that has worked for a long time.
I'm going into history here with Carl Jung himself.
Oh, yes. I was wondering when we were going to get to that.
And Jung has, nobody knows exactly what happened and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, he had deep, involved relationships with Sabina Spielrein and with Toni Wolff.
Well, and Toni Wolff, this is the relationship where he would have Toni Wolff, if I recall correctly, she would come to Sunday dinner and
Yes.
She would sit at the table with Emma. And again, if I recall correctly, at the psychological club, he would come down the stairs with Emma on one arm and Toni on the other, and they would all go to Eranos together. I mean, he really...
And he traveled with her.
Yes.
He and Toni went on at least one trip to Italy and maybe other places together.
Yeah, I know. I think he would always bring her to Eranos in Italy.
And the rationale was, people have sort of interpreted this and kind of given him a pass because when he was a very young child, his mother had some sort of, people speculated about it, but she was an odd, to say the least, person. And he also had a nursemaid. And so people said, well, because of his mother's perhaps, mental illnesses and this nursemaid, that he had a split anima.
Doesn't he talk about that in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections? I think he does.
I'm not sure if he uses that term, but he may. But that sounds to me like exactly the kind of intellectualization, rationalization, and sort of giving things a psychological sort of quote explanation, unquote, that makes it okay.
Well, and they were real partners in terms of creative work. They did a lot of exploration together and writing together. I mean, it was a real deep relationship, and one that he just decided he wasn't going to be apologetic about. And on the one hand, we can say, well, look, this brilliant man And he felt that he needed Toni as his soror mystica, or whatever you'd like to call it. And then there are the stories about what that was like for Emma.
Exactly. It was very hard on her. She protested, felt left out, 100 things. And, for me, I go to sort of this practical bottom line. I've had this fantasy about what if both Carl Jung and Emma had lived in Brooklyn, in a little apartment like Jackie Gleason and the Honeymooners.
On Flatbush Avenue.
Yes, on Flatbush Avenue. And then Emma would say something like, Carl, it's either her or me, anima schmanima, get over it, or your rear end is going to be back at the Burkholtzy.
You sound just like Joan Rivers right now.
Yeah, I don't think Emma ever did that.
She could have, although Swiss law, I think, gave Jung financial control, but
of all of her
money. She came from an extremely wealthy family in Switzerland. The point is, are we going to kind of cut to the chase here about what's psychological, real hard rock, bottom line truth here? How much of this is ego, justification, cover up, and how much of it is coming in any one specific case from a very deep quest for inner exploration through, a multiple relationship, like the person you were mentioning, Joseph. I personally have to say I'm skeptical that happens a lot. I think this feels to me like sort of a normalization, rationalization, glossing something over.
Well, I also think that, if we move out of this, this cultural lens, we know that even though we could categorize 100 people's behavior under a particular term, these 100 people are polyamorous. If we were working with each of them, actually the incredibly unique constellation of memories, events, values, all of that, are mobilizing them in ways that are very specific. Coming back to what you said, Deb, about the feeling that polyamory is somehow just a cover for these other things. But if we want to stay in the psychological dimension, then I would ask you, what are the deep psychological events that are, quote unquote, being covered by polyamory? What's your theory about that?
I don't know if I have a theory, but my concern would be exactly that from a psychological perspective, exactly what is going on here and what is going on in the unconscious. It can be almost anything. And my concern is that there's ego, cognition, and certainly feeling involved. But, from what I've read about how people sit and they talk and they discuss and they, sort of say, you've got to get over infantile attachment stuff and so on and so forth, that it feels like the unconscious is not always being deeply engaged. And your point is well taken that it's different for every single person. But I have concerns about the real psychological wellsprings.
But what I want to highlight is language like concerns or the intensity around the conversation. So, because I think that, the goddess Hera, who's the goddess of marriage, is also speaking into the collection. And Hera, who, kind of had a particular single value around monogamy and children and marriage in the home, when Hera is invoked, anything that isn't in her paradigm then becomes wrong. So just to kind of circle around this, we're not talking about content, for instance, growing bodies of research. We're talking about the feeling that it's offensive, because that's coming from somewhere else. And the intensity around perhaps how foolish polyamory is or how ridiculous it is for people to think that that's an option, which is kind of a current of feeling. Why is this more offensive or outrageous? That's what deserves curiosity, I think, at the moment, at least.
I don't know for me that it's foolish or outrageous. I am skeptical, and I think I've already articulated, my basic stance around this. But I can imagine a number of other issues about which I would be, equally questioning, equally wondering, equally, help me here. I don't think I get it. I'm particularly interested just in where the shadow is, where the unconscious is, and I could imagine a lot of sort of historical phenomena that were very, widely accepted at the time that, I hope if I'd been back there, that I would have been skeptical and questioning about the role of women in, let's say, medieval Europe. I'm kind of making this up. That too would have felt like something that probably would have stirred me.
Part of the answer to that question, Joseph, I can jump in, is I have seen it cause people great suffering.
Yes.
Like everything else. By the way, why is that more suffering than all kinds of other things, though, such that it would make you so passionate?
What I would say is that this is a road that some people embark upon being told that it's going to make them happy, that it's going to make them free. And then that is not at all what happens in my experience, at least some of the time. And it brings suffering. So there's a little bit of self-delusion going on at times, I think.
It is new. What I want to lift up to make sure we're landing, our libido's landing on the right thing, because there are two agendas in the conversation I think are so important. And I think this is also really important for the listeners. There's the archetype of polyamory, which needs its own exploration. And then there's this phenomena of tacit approval without a depth consideration.
Yes.
And part of what we really need to draw out, so we can separate them, is that it is deeply troubling when anyone feels swept away into behaviors that have never been deeply examined, and that could be applied to anything.
Yes.
So that's part of your concern around the phenomena of polyamory.
Yeah, and the cultural phenomena is this is kind of being sold a little bit in some quarters anyway. It's being, I think glamorized a bit. And the message is something like this, that sex should be about pleasure, that it should be okay to love lots of people. Well, you know what? Sex is pleasurable, but it's not really about pleasure. It's about attachment.
Yeah.
Well, I would say relationships about attachment. Sex may not be.
I think sex is about attachment.
Well, then nobody would ever have sex for the first time because you're not attached to somebody generally.
No. But you become attached when you have sex.
But that has nothing to do with love. That's just attachment.
No, love is attachment, Joseph. That's what love is.
We have to disagree about that, because how many people are in terrible marriages because they're attached to their spouse and there's absolutely no love, but there's attachment.
See, I disagree. I think that is love. How else do you define love?
But you've boiled it down to some like oxytocin squirt, like happened in the brain, and I'm attached. Because attachment can be formed purely neurologically.
I'm going to break up this debate. So the ref has stepped in here. I'm going back to your question about why the intensity, and I think relationships have such heat potential and potential for damage and injury. We are relational creatures. So it's a very different thing. I'm thinking about your example of being gay. Well, that's a question of maybe personal identity, where one's erotic feelings go. That's about me, so to speak. And a relationship has to do with so many deep-seated feelings and our psychology. And we mentioned Emma Jung was very disturbed, hurt, angry. I'm imagining all the feelings she might have had. So relationship stuff is not just about one person. And we can't be cavalier once we are involving other people. I think we have to be very careful, and sexuality stirs emotions. It does stir attachment. Maybe it doesn't always stir attachment, but I don't think for most people over time, that sex is just another thing like eating breakfast.
Well, and Deb, you're saying we have to be careful when we involve other people. I want to bring up this other issue we haven't touched on is what about children?
Oh, sure, when polyamory emerges in a pair bonding with kids, yeah.
Yes. And I think that, again, I'm sure there are people who do it well, but that intense falling in love feeling that you get in a new relationship is consuming, and it's supposed to be. It's like the only thing you can think about is that other person, and that's kind of that limerence phase. And then it fades, and then, in a kind of traditional, conventional relationship, then the kids come, and you're not in that limerence phase with your partner. And that's a good thing because the kids need your attention at that point. And if you're in that householder stage where you're caring for children and you start a new relationship, you're not as available to the kids. And I have seen this wasn't polyamory, but I have seen in my practice people whose one parent or another had affair after affair after affair. And it was a kind of trauma because the parent was never really available. So that's another concern that I have. And Joseph, I really liked our moment there. Reminded me of the Philadelphia sports radio in the morning.
Yeah.
Angelo Cataldi yelling every morning.
Yeah, it's fabulous. It's very exciting. But I'd like to step away from the passion, which is a lot of fun, by the way. And just actually, let's put on our analyst caps, that kind of, impersonal, investigational lens. And let's decide that, pair bonding, which might involve sexual exclusivity in the pair bonding, is a kind of norm and will have the supposition that it allows all kinds of benefits to happen internally and externally. So if we then think of polyamory, just for conversation, as the best solution that the psyche can come up with in response to a situation, which is Jung's way of talking about a symptom, that he didn't think symptoms were horrible. He said symptoms were the best reaction that somebody's got in a given situation. And let's say polyamory is the best symptom, the best reaction to what's going on. Let's drop down and ask, what if polyamory is a way of avoiding a certain intolerable tension? And as I look generationally, let's say into the millennial generation, which, by the way, I love working with the millennials. I think they're just kind of glorious in so many ways. But one of the hallmarks that I think we're seeing in the culture is that generationally, there's a great avoidance of tension and discomfort and suffering. This is changing the work environment. Millennials came into Google and Amazon and they said, I'm not sitting at a desk, it's uncomfortable. So in order to have a really trained work staff, Google started developing rooms that had mattresses on the floor and bean bags. And, because millennials didn't want to be uncomfortable in chairs anymore. All kinds of accommodations. A young person now feels, uncomfortable in the lecture hall of their freshman class. And so, bringing an emotional support animal is now considered, acceptable as a way of addressing. So let's just say that perhaps this is something we're observing. So somebody is experimenting with pair bonding. And as we said, being monogamous has a lot of tensions in it. The tension to sacrifice other sexual opportunities, the tension around having to be confronted by personality flaws and immaturities, all kinds of tensions. And then the psyche not having any better way of managing those tensions, and also buying into the idea that I should always be comfortable. Why should I tolerate not being comfortable? Then in the collective, this idea of polyamory as a way of coping with tensions as the best solution. Well, if I just have several people I'm dating, I don't ever have to feel sexually frustrated, or I'll perhaps always feel sexually excited. I can avoid being confronted because my personality has rough edges, and that feels like a solution for the time being. Maybe.
You're describing it as a defense, which is what we've been saying. It's a defense against discomfort.
Jung asked, that's a Freudian view. But Jung said he didn't buy into that in the same way. He said every symptom has at its core the solution, that they are reaching for something.
Of course they're reaching for something, but it can also be a neurotic response that avoids the legitimate suffering.
And the neurotic response has in it the seed of the solution.
It only has the seed of the solution if the person is working it. That is the issue, is that it has to become bothersome so that so that it can foster a confrontation internally with the unconscious. And if it just remains a palliative of this is what I do whenever tensions become intolerable.
Yeah, because then you could just drink too, right?
I was about to say, and you might as well just, go to the bar every night and have knock back a few brews. It has to become a crisis somehow.
Right.
It doesn't always become a crisis.
Right, because when a new behavior emerges and it's never bothersome and it never creates a crisis, then we call that an adaptation. Because I'm actually believing you, Deb. If something actually doesn't create problems, is it a problem? And if it's still viewed as a problem, who's the one sitting up on Mount Olympus looking down and saying it's a problem, although it's not a problem for anybody else?
Well, first of all, I think it is a problem for other people. As I have said repeatedly, I have seen this cause great suffering. Anytime you avoid your own soul, that's a problem that eventually results in symptoms. And Jung said, man will do anything to avoid dealing with his own soul.
But you're saying that when you're in a consult session with somebody and they are bringing you their suffering, then it is bothersome. And I'm agreeing that if it's bothersome, then actually it's a symptom. And there's something in the symptom that's going to tell you what the conflict is. But on the other side, if the concern is, as you guys were saying, people could go on forward and there's never a bother, that there actually is no suffering around it.
I have said repeatedly, I'm sure there are people who are doing it well. And that's one thing. What my issue is that people are being told that this is this groovy new thing and you're really hip if you're doing it, and that it's really easy and it will be this kind of utopian solution. And I think that's
a problem.
Yes.
As we said, because it's not being examined with depth.
Exactly.
Not because it's polyamory. It's just not being depthfully held like anything else not depthful.
Exactly.
So what I keep struggling with...
We're not disagreeing with you.
No, we're not. But it's that when things in the conversation get all stuck together in one big roiling massa confusa, then the argument kind of falls apart. If we keep separating it out into different pieces, then we can continue to try to ask the question, which is, what is polyamory about? Which we have not actually, I think, landed on. What we've talked a lot about is the feelings about it, how it may be affecting people. But what is the idea of many loves? Poly, many, amor, love. What is that as a human phenomena? Because it's happening, and it's been happening for thousands of years, whether or not it's been legitimized. We're just arguing about whether or not it should be legitimized. What is polyamory about?
Well, I think it's probably about many things, just like anything else, Joseph. I mean, I think sometimes it's a defense, and sometimes it's a creative adaptation.
Well, I also think it has to do with which of the gods is dominant in your psyche, is what I would suppose, going purely to archetypes. Deb, I know you've been trying to talk. I'm going to hush up.
No, what I'm pondering here is what our process has been about, especially in this last, I'll say 20 minutes or half hour. What is the nature of our argument, so to speak, about it? That this has stirred something, and it doesn't have to do just with many loves. We all have friends and relatives and lots of people in our lives that we love. So it has to do with a nature of physical intimacy. And just, maybe in my own defense, honestly, I think I have been trying to wear a Jungian hat around this, but I think what we're touching on is some area of morality or judgment, or somehow not having a sufficient range of emotional motion, so to speak. And I do. This does sort of raise a red flag for me, the same way that a red flag would be raised if a client came in and this has happened for me. That every night after work I go to the bar and I have anywhere from 3 to 6 drinks. Okay, I mean, maybe we could say that's an adaptation. You're doing okay. You're holding down a job. You're single. What the hell? But from a Jungian perspective, what happens for me is it's sort of like, whoa, what is going on here? What is really going on here? And that is the stance I've been trying to take with whatever success around this subject of polyamory. What is going on here? And it could be different for any given individual. But my first reaction is to take a step back and go, I'm not so sure about this.
Well, I think being curious is at the center of all of our work analytically.
Absolutely.
What I can hear in your conversation is kind of the voice of Hygeia, the goddess of hygiene. And what I mean by that is we're looking at this behavior of polyamory and we're wondering about the psychological hygiene of it. Does it promote good health of the psyche or not? And we may need very substantial longitudinal studies in order to be able to come to some theories about how it affects the hygiene of the psyche.
Exactly.
And of course, we shouldn't assume that it's going to be one way or another to be a kind of psychological scientist. But that's one lens there. I'd also want to just drop in that I think all of this is in the archetypal realm of Aphrodite and Venus, the goddess of love. When I discovered this next bit of information, I was so fascinated, is that Aphrodite and Mars, or Venus and Aries, had children, but they had many children. The child that always gets a lot of discussion is Eros, or Cupid in the popular culture. And the archetypal image is that, Cupid would fire these arrows into a human heart and it would rouse, all kinds of love. And because we have become, in the US particularly, a very romantic and sentimental culture, that's the dimension of Aphrodite that we spend an awful lot of time thinking about. But Aphrodite had a lot of children, and the 4 erotes, one was Eros, who would penetrate the defended heart and evoke love, and particularly love for a particular object. It wasn't like love for humanity. It was love towards somebody. Anteros was another child of Aphrodite who actually would fire lead arrows at those who scorned love. And it would create an almost suicidal despair in the person. Himeros was one of her children who inspired lust. Pothos inspired longing. Phobos inspired fear, harmonia, harmony. And when I look down the list of the children of Aphrodite, they are all dimensions of love. We're in love, we're married, our spouse starts to look like they're going to leave us, and we're full of phobos, fear. We first get married, we're setting up a home. Harmonia, lands in the relationship, and we want to have this domestic harmony. We're in love with somebody, and then they don't care about us. As a part of us wants to hit them with a lead club. So there are many dimensions around this idea of love. But the three I'd like to just parse out qualitatively, because I think this is part of the discussion of analyzing any form of a love relationship, is there really is a differentiation between sex and eros and love, or at least we can, in terms of just examining the factors of it. And what I would say about sex is that sex, when the energy of sex is present, there is a building of tension in the body, in the psyche, in the nervous system, and in the neurotransmitters. And sex leads to behaviors that will relieve that tension. And we can just kind of put it neatly in that category. I think eros has to do with, to a certain degree, longing and interaction. And when eros has to do with partnering, what it leads to is joy. And that's why, for instance, we have friends, and it's full of so much eros that we could just talk all night long and everything flows. And the product of that is joy versus relaxation with sex. And I actually think that love has to do with the longing for union, and that leads to peace. And that's why we can, in so many religions of Christianity, love and peace, love and harmony. Because what's missing finally comes together and the tension of the opposites feels resolved. And that leads to peace. I think as we're listening to this as a social phenomena, we're also listening to our clients. Is this about sex and sexual tension? Is this about a pursuit and fostering of joy? Is this about a seeking for completeness and peace? Often it's a combination, but not always. So that's one just way that I'm trying to listen to people as they categorize something. And this is also the danger. Somebody says, "Oh, I'm polyamorous," and we can think that we know what they're talking about. But I actually feel suspicious about that in any conversation, whatever people tell. Yeah.
Because there's this cultural phenomenon that, you can read about it. There's a lot of articles that come out about it periodically. And then there's the lived experience of it in the life of an individual, which is always going to be unique. And someone comes in and this is going on for them. And of course, the first question is, well, and what is it for this person in this person's life? And it's going to be different every time.
And that's at the place. Yeah. What does it mean to you? Because that word can mean a million things.
I would love to move on to a dream. Oh, please. Thank you very much.
Oh, Hera has had enough. Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Our dreamer is 29 years old and is a woman, and she's a social worker, healer, artist. And here's the dream. I'm walking alongside the man that I'm currently dating. He is on my right side. Suddenly on my left side, the man I'm still in love with appears with the woman he has a child with. In waking life, he has a child with a woman he did not marry and co-parents. I'm still not over him and wish we were together. In the dream, he has had another child with her. I'm surprised he's had another child with her. It makes me think he has had even more intimacy and work to do with her in his life path. I am stuck in the middle. The man I am dating is on my right side, but I'm not really interested in him. Even though he treats me wonderfully in real life, he doesn't feel like the one. The man I desire is on my left with a woman and 2 kids, a life and world he's been focusing on. He sees me, and I feel this strong and pleasant attraction and connection between us, like a youthful friendship mixed with love. And I know that he continues to be interested in me too, even though we are apart. I wake up confused but happy to have had a positive dream about his feelings toward me. In waking life, I continue to regret our breakup, and he has ignored attempts I've made to rekindle a friendship and begin communication again. Now, for context, she writes that she started dating a man who treated her very wonderfully and fit 90% of what she was looking for in a mate. But she felt sad because she knew deep within that he wasn't the one for her. She'd also reached out to her ex, the other man in the dream, and had been ignored again. She also adds that she's not sure why there would be a second child in the dream, and that sometimes her dreams come true. The main feelings were that she had a feeling of boredom about the other man, feeling stuck with him or on the wrong path, and wanting to be with the second man, her ex. And she felt excitement and happiness and warmth when she realized that he was interested in her too. And again, surprise about the second child and some annoyance about it. And at the very end, she adds that she would like children and feels jealous he's had a baby with another woman. And she does hope for good things, both men, for her ex and for her other man. Both men are very similar, and that although one treats her well, she doesn't have the love feeling toward him, and that the other, who is her unrequited love, who seems to be uninterested in her. So I'm just going right to the very beginning of the dream, and such a wonderful visual image of her psychic dilemma, that she is walking in the middle between these 2 men who are very similar, she says.
Mm-hmm.
One is the one she can't have, that in the dream has just had another child with this other woman. And the other one is this wonderful guy who treats her at 90% of what she'd like in a mate, but she doesn't have strong feelings for him.
This configuration brings up to me the psychic situation that has sometimes been referred to as the ghostly lover, where you feel compelled by something that is unattainable, and it takes you away from that which is available in real life. And there are a couple of examples from that. Curiously, both of the 2 that come immediately to mind are from ballet. There's a ballet called La Sylphide, in which a young man is engaged to be married, but on the eve of his wedding day, he sees a beautiful fairy and becomes so entranced with her that he is no longer able to be available to his kind of worldly bride. And the other example would be Swan Lake, which has a similar kind of theme, where there's the beautiful white swan maiden that the hero falls in love with, and he promises to be true to her, but then he's seduced by the black swan. So it's this way that we can become seduced, and often, in some stories, that seduction, this is why it's ghostly, can really be a kind of inner figure. And I see this a lot in women who have had a father wound, where there's a negative father complex, where the father's love perhaps always felt elusive. This kind of situation can develop in the psyche.
I'm thinking about building on what you're saying, Lisa, of the term in psychology of the exciting object. That can often go right hand in hand with a father complex of the man who was there and not there.
Yeah. So explain exciting object, Deb.
The exciting object is the one we desire, the one we quest after, the one we want to be found worthy and fun and attractive and special.
This is this weird thing in psychobabble where object really actually means person,
Yeah,
right?
Thank you for that. That's exactly
I'd
right.
love to jump in there a bit because I've been thinking about this. This idea is very important. It comes from a Scottish psychoanalyst named Fairbairn. And it has to do with the way that a child can be wounded when they are not adequately loved, which is really what Lisa and Deb are pointing to. And the full model, which I think is so instructive, is that we have a little child, they're seeking love, let's say from the father, and the father sometimes might be kind and sometimes might actually be very cruel. And so the demand in the child to be bonded is primordial and is going to try to do that. In order to do that, the child generates a split image in themselves. And one is the image of the father when he's a kind of ogre, and the other is the image of the father in his most wondrous aspects. When the child is relating to the wondrous father, the father is constantly exciting, but also withholding, never quite gives the goods that are promised. And then the child's ego feels that if it can just be pleasing enough, and then becomes a lifetime of pleasing just to get this elusive but glorious love. The other side of it is that the psyche's ego will split, and then the part of the ego that's dealing with the ogre constantly wants to destroy, trick, undermine the figure. And so often, as the child grows up in relationship to love, they have these two perceptions of the beloved as a monster and as impossibly alluring, and the two parts of themselves that want to destroy the monster and are trying to figure out how to finally please the luminous one.
And what we can see in this kind of dynamic that you've articulated, Joseph, so clearly is a repetition compulsion. That this leads to an attraction to the impossible man. That this time it'll work. This time I can make it happen. Now I'm an adult. I have more skills, more to offer. And underneath all that, the unconscious is simply repeating the drama that took place at an earlier age, both hoping that it will be different this time and expecting the same thing to happen because that is the relational template that is familiar to the psyche.
And so if we're going back to the dream, we would wonder about why the second child, right? Because that's the part that departs from life. And if I were working with this person, I would want to explore the image of the other woman as a possible shadow image. So the other woman in this setup often contains shadow. Perhaps she actually knows this woman in real life. She certainly has some imagination about her. And I would be willing to bet that there's been some kind of shadow projected onto her. And so we could understand this new baby as the offspring of the unattainable animus and the shadow. So it would be a new potential in her, but one that feels very alien, very far from ego. And again, it's hard to go further than that without the dreamer with us. But I've seen these kinds of dreams before, and this is often how they work out.
I really like your thinking here, Lisa. And I'm thinking about what is a child? So there has been one child of a new possibility, a new creative potential in the world, and now another. And I'm thinking, what might that be in her psyche? Because I'm also thinking that, how does someone with a ghostly lover, a repetition compulsion, a father wound, as these are all hypotheticals, but how does one unhook from that? And what role might these dream children have in that? Here is a woman that's been fruitful.
Yes. Yeah. So there is this potential in her. And it would be interesting to look at what might the new attitude be that's represented by the dream children.
Yes.
I see versions of this dream in men's psychology as well, where men will have dreams of women that they think are stunning who are constantly choosing other men. and they're sitting there feeling abandoned and bereft. Even if the people are known, I will tend to want to move back and think about it as a psychic structure. So the dream ego is the woman's personality as she experiences herself to be. And what if all of the men represent her animus, which represents her creative potential, her spirit, her dynamism, her agency.
Her relationship with the unconscious.
Relationship with the unconscious. And it begs the question of this, what's being dramatized is the ego is not appealing, but other versions of her are appealing and in fact are bearing fruit. In fact, the animus is in deep, fertile relationship to. If we can depersonalize the dream, what I would have men do in that situation is to really examine the inner men that are being chosen and to try to discern what are they bringing forward that I'm so resistant to.
Yeah.
And in active imagination to sit with the other, for her to sit with these men and ask them, what is it that you want? What is it you want from me? What is it you find so alluring with these other expressions of the feminine?
So Joseph, building on what you just said, what I would ask someone who had a dream like this to do is perhaps in an active imagination, really make friends with the other woman. It's connecting with that split off shadow side, the other feminine part of you that might help you understand how to integrate these cut off parts.
And there's various men in the psyche, so it seems like there's an opportunity for her to be polyamorous.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
All right.
My last words would be, this was what I would be interested in, is here's a guy that you're dating, dreamer, who meets 90% of what you are looking for in a mate.
Not too bad.
That is pretty stellar.
And he treats you great.
He treats you great. What is preventing you from wanting what you can have?
Yeah, that's a good question.
In the real world, why is this not acceptable and even celebratory?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's an inner dynamic, I think, that's keeping the streamer from wanting what she can have.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because when we're unwilling to be paired, when we're unwilling to be joined, then we'll find the slightest imperfection. And that shows up in fairy tales all the time. Suitors come up and just the slightest imperfection in the fairy tale makes them absolutely unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think this throuple should sign off for tonight.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.